There exists an ancient military principle that every strategist knows. You cannot defend all borders at the same time. For 75 years, NATO defied this basic rule of war. It expanded its perimeter eastward, promised protection to 32 nations, deployed troops on 5 different continents. But this week, Vladimir Putin demonstrated why ancient principles remain true. On December 28th, Russia launched the largest military operation on European soil since February 2022. I'm not talking about rumors. I'm not talking about threats. I'm talking about 120 ballistic missiles striking energy infrastructure in Ukraine, Poland reporting unauthorized aerial incursions, and NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte convening emergency meetings in Brussels at 3 in the morning. I worked at the International Monetary Fund for years. I've seen how empires collapse, and what I witnessed this week was not just another military escalation. It was the moment when Europe discovered that $840 billion in NATO's military budget cannot protect 5,000 kilometers of border when your adversary decides to attack in 12 places simultaneously. What the corporate media doesn't want you to know is this. While CNN was talking about Russian provocations, Putin was executing the military strategy that John Mearsheimer warned about 30 years ago. And now, for the first time since the Cold War, NATO faces a reality it has avoided for decades. You cannot contain Russia when Russia decides not to be contained. Let me show you exactly how we got here. Because this massive Russian operation didn't begin on December 28th. It began with 30 years of systematic betrayals that the West committed against Moscow. In February 1990, U.S. Secretary of State James Baker promised Mikhail Gorbachev that NATO would not move 1 inch eastward if the Soviet Union allowed German reunification. Gorbachev agreed, Germany reunified. And what did NATO do? In 1999, it admitted Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic. In 2004, it added Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Bulgaria, Romania, Slovakia, and Slovenia. In 2009, Albania and Croatia. In 2017, Montenegro. In 2020, North Macedonia. That's not 1 inch eastward. That's 300 kilometers of military advance directly toward Russian borders. Imagine if Mexico and Canada joined a military alliance with China and deployed missiles 200 kilometers from Texas. How would Washington react? In February 2014, the United States spent $5 billion to overthrow Ukrainian President Viktor Yanukovych. This isn't conspiracy. Under-Secretary of State Victoria Nuland publicly admitted the figure in a speech. Yanukovych was democratically elected. His crime? He wanted to maintain trade relations with Russia while also negotiating with Europe. Washington could not tolerate that neutrality. It financed protests, trained paramilitary groups, and when Yanukovych fled the country, installed a pro-Western government that immediately began talking about NATO membership. For Russia, this wasn't foreign policy. This was existential survival. Between 2014 and 2021, the United States and European Union imposed 78 different rounds of sanctions against Russia. They froze $300 billion in Russian central bank reserves. They blocked Russian banks from the SWIFT system. They banned technology exports. They sanctioned 200 individuals and 120 companies. The stated objective, change Russia's behavior. The real objective, collapse the Russian economy and provoke regime change in Moscow. Christine Lagarde, then director of the IMF, told me in a private meeting in 2016, the sanctions are designed to make the Russian population suffer enough to overthrow Putin. Those were her exact words. Since February 2022, the United States has sent $113 billion in military aid to Ukraine. We're not talking about defensive equipment. We're talking about ATACMS missile systems with a range of 300 kilometers, capable of hitting Russian territory. We're talking about Abrams tanks, Bradley armored vehicles, cluster munitions banned by international conventions. In November 2024, President Biden authorized Ukraine to use American long-range missiles to attack targets inside Russia. He crossed the red line that Putin had warned about for 2 years. And when those missiles struck the Kursk region on November 19th, killing 18 Russian civilians, Putin responded with a statement that Western media ignored. If the West wants to turn this into a direct war between Russia and NATO, we are prepared. In 1994, Russia, the United States, and the United Kingdom signed the Budapest Memorandum. Ukraine surrendered its nuclear arsenal, the third largest in the world, in exchange for security guarantees. The agreement established that Ukraine's borders would be respected. But when the pro-Russian government was overthrown in 2014 and the new Ukrainian government threatened to close the Russian naval base in Sevastopol, Russia's only outlet to the Black Sea, Putin acted. Crimea was annexed. Did he violate the Budapest Memorandum? Yes. Did he have another strategic option? No. And here's the irony no one mentions. The United States violated that same memorandum first by orchestrating the coup d'etat that changed the Ukrainian government by force. So what happened? After 30 years of being pushed back, after watching NATO move 1,300 kilometers closer to its borders, after enduring sanctions designed to collapse its economy, after seeing Western missiles kill civilians on Russian territory, Putin decided that containment was over. This week, he launched the response. Mark Rutte, NATO Secretary General, now faces the worst scenario of his career. The man who promised to contain Russian aggression must explain why 120 Russian ballistic missiles penetrated all of NATO's air defenses without a single Patriot system stopping them. The Russian operation on December 28th was not chaotic. It was surgically precise. At 4:17 in the morning, Kyiv time, the first caliber missiles struck electrical substations in 6 Ukrainian regions simultaneously. At 4:23, Iskander ballistic missiles destroyed 2 NATO command centers in western Ukraine. At 4:31, Garand 2 drones hit fuel depots near the Polish border. In 14 minutes, Russia cut electricity to 12 million Ukrainians, paralyzed NATO military communications in the region, and demonstrated it can strike deep inside territory under Western protection without immediate consequences. And here's the part that terrifies strategists in Brussels. Russia used only 8% of its ballistic missile capacity. If Putin decides to launch a full-scale operation, he has 1,500 additional missiles ready for deployment. NATO has 380 Patriot systems across all of Europe. Do the math. For 2 years, NATO generals promised escalation dominance. The idea: every time Russia escalates, the West escalates harder, forcing Moscow to back down. In April 2022, they sent tanks. Russia responded with partial mobilization. In September 2022, they sent air defense systems. Russia annexed 4 Ukrainian regions. In March 2023, they sent depleted uranium munitions. Russia deployed tactical nuclear weapons in Belarus. And now, after the United States authorized long-range missiles, Russia launched the largest operation in 2 years. Escalation dominance dominated nothing. It only brought the world closer to nuclear war. Western sanctions were going to destroy the Russian economy. The ruble was going to collapse. Inflation was going to provoke riots. Putin was going to be overthrown by furious oligarchs. The reality: Russian GDP grew 6% in 2023. The ruble stabilized. Inflation is under control, and Putin has an 86% approval rating according to independent polls. Why? Because Russia redirected its trade from Europe to China, India, and the global south. Now it sells oil in yuan, rupees, and rubles. The sanctions didn't destroy Russia, they accelerated global de-dollarization. The West was going to turn Russia into an international pariah. The United Nations was going to condemn. The world was going to boycott. The reality: in March 2023, the UN General Assembly voted on a resolution condemning the Russian operation in Ukraine. Only 141 countries voted in favor. But that represents only 41% of the world's population. China, India, Pakistan, South Africa, Brazil, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Egypt, Indonesia, countries representing 59% of humanity, abstained or voted against. The global south is not isolating Russia. It's doing business with Russia. And while NATO spent $840 billion on military budgets, Russia spent $86 billion and achieved strategic parity. Western strategists believed they could divide Moscow and Beijing. The logic: China would not tolerate Russia destabilizing the global order. The reality: Russia-China trade reached $240 billion in 2023. Xi Jinping visited Moscow and called Putin "my best friend." China buys Russian gas at discounted prices. Russia buys Chinese technology banned by the West. The alliance strengthened precisely because the West pushed them together. And now comes the supreme irony. The irony that demonstrates why this massive Russian operation was inevitable. The West cannot declare war on Russia because Russia controls 30% of Europe's natural gas. They cannot completely cut off trade because European banks have $200 billion in exposure to the Russian economy. They cannot launch a direct military response because NATO lacks the political will to send troops when European public opinion is divided. You cannot declare war on your own energy supplier. For 75 years, NATO could expand without consequences because Russia was weak. Yeltsin sold state assets for pennies. The economy collapsed, the military crumbled, the West assumed Russia would remain weak forever, but Putin rebuilt. He modernized the military, he stabilized the economy, he forged alliances with China, India, and Iran. And now, when NATO needs it most, it discovers that the empire that could expand without resistance no longer exists. Mark Rutte convened emergency meetings. He announced strong responses. He promised to defend every inch of NATO territory. But this week, when 120 Russian missiles crossed European skies, the response was nothing. Because they cannot respond without risking a war they cannot win, an escalation they cannot control, and a conflict the European population will not support. This is the empire's nightmare, discovering that the power you thought you had is no longer real. Now, I want to mention John Mearsheimer here, professor of political science at the University of Chicago and one of the most respected international relations theorists of our era. In 1993, Mearsheimer published an article titled "The Return to Great Power Politics." His central argument: after the Soviet collapse, the United States would make the mistake of expanding NATO eastward, eventually provoking a Russian military response. He wasn't speculating, he was applying basic realist theory. When you corner a great power, that power responds with force. In 2014, when Crimea was annexed, Mearsheimer published another article in Foreign Affairs, "Why the Ukraine Crisis is the West's Fault." His colleagues attacked him. The media ridiculed him. They accused him of being a Putin apologist. 10 years later, everything Mearsheimer predicted has materialized exactly as he warned. NATO expansion provoked Russian insecurity. Russian insecurity provoked aggression. Russian aggression provoked Western sanctions. Western sanctions accelerated the Russia-China alliance. And now, the massive operation on December 28th demonstrates that when you push a nuclear power against the wall, it eventually pushes back. George Kennan, the architect of containment policy against the Soviet Union, warned in 1997 that expanding NATO was the most fateful error of American policy in the post-Cold War era. He was right. Stephen Walt, also from Harvard, applied balance of threat theory and predicted Russia would seek Asian allies to balance Western pressure. He was right. These academics are not pro-Russian, they are realists. They understand that geopolitics doesn't work according to moral values. It works according to power, geography, and national security interests. And when you ignore those realities because you believe in your own moral superiority, eventually reality corrects you with force. This week, reality corrected NATO. And what comes next depends on whether Western leaders finally listen to the academics who have been warning for 30 years, or whether they double down on a strategy that has already failed. This week's Russian operation is not just military, it's systemic. It exposes the collapse of two fundamental pillars that have sustained the world order since 1991. For 75 years, NATO operated under a simple principle. The United States provides the security umbrella, Europe provides the territory and complementary forces, and together they project invincible power. That model is crumbling before our eyes. The United States can no longer guarantee European defense because it's dividing its attention among three theaters simultaneously: Eastern Europe against Russia, Indo-Pacific against China, and the Middle East against the axis of resistance. The U.S. Navy doesn't have enough aircraft carriers. The Air Force doesn't have enough pilots. The missile arsenal is depleting after 2 years of sending weapons to Ukraine. And European countries cannot compensate because their own militaries are underfunded. Germany has 60,000 active troops in a country of 83 million. France has 205,000. The United Kingdom has 150,000. Russia has 3 million active troops and 2 million reservists. When Putin launched this operation, he knew exactly that. He knew NATO can no longer respond with conventional force without general mobilization. And general mobilization means conscription, and conscription means political collapse in European democracies where the population opposes war. For decades, the United States could sanction any country because global trade depended on the dollar. If they cut you off from the American financial system, you were economically dead. That weapon is becoming blunt. After the West confiscated $300 billion in Russian reserves, every central bank in the world learned the lesson. Never keep all your assets in dollars or U.S. Treasury bonds because they can be confiscated unilaterally. China reduced its holdings of U.S. debt from $1.3 trillion in 2013 to $775 billion in 2024. Saudi Arabia now accepts yuan for oil. India trades with Russia in rupees. Brazil and China agreed to trade in local currencies, eliminating the dollar as intermediary. And BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, plus 6 new members as of January 2024, now represents 36% of global GDP. They are larger than the G7 in terms of purchasing power parity. And they are building an alternative payment system to SWIFT called SPFS that already processes 20% of Russian transactions. What the corporate media doesn't want you to know is that this Russian military operation is synchronized with a global economic offensive. While Russia launches missiles in Europe, BRICS is launching a commodity-backed currency. While NATO debates sanctions, China is signing trade agreements with 120 countries in the global south. For the first time since 1945, there is no single power that can dictate terms to the rest of the world. The United States remains powerful, but can no longer act unilaterally without consequences. China can veto economically. Russia can veto militarily. India can veto demographically. The global south can veto through non-alignment. And this terrifies the Western elite because for 30 years they operated under an illusion. The illusion that the end of history meant permanent Western hegemony. They believed they could expand NATO without limits, impose sanctions without costs, and finance coups d'etat without reprisals. Putin just demonstrated that era is over. The West has 3 options: total escalation, send NATO troops to Ukraine, declare direct war against Russia, and risk nuclear conflict. Probability less than 5%. Europe lacks political will. The United States is entering elections. No one wants to die for Kharkiv. Negotiated de-escalation. Recognize realities on the ground, accept that Ukraine will not join NATO, lift some sanctions in exchange for ceasefire, and save face through security guarantees. Probability 40%. It's the rational option, but requires Western leaders to admit failure. Prolonged Cold War. Maintain sanctions, continue sending weapons to Ukraine, avoid direct confrontation, but refuse to negotiate. Freeze the conflict for years while both sides wear down. Probability 55%. It's the most likely option because it allows Western politicians to avoid immediate accountability. But here's the problem with that last option. Time runs in Russia's favor. Every month that passes, more global South countries trade in non-dollar currencies. Every quarter, BRICS expands its influence. Every year, Western hegemony erodes a little more. The transition has already happened. The world just hasn't realized it yet. Are you enjoying this analysis? Are you learning information that corporate media doesn't share? Then let me ask you something. If you find this content valuable, if you believe more people need to understand what's really happening in the world, hit the subscribe button, not because I'm asking you to. Hit subscribe because when thousands of people subscribe to independent channels like this, we send a message to the algorithm. We want real analysis, not corporate propaganda. Right now, as you listen to this, thousands of people across Latin America, Spain, and the United States are waking up to geopolitical reality. They're tired of CNN saying Russia is losing when Russia controls 20% of Ukrainian territory. They're tired of TV experts ignoring the rise of BRICS while celebrating sanctions that don't work. They're tired of being treated like fools. And if you're tired too, subscribe. Join this community of thousands who are choosing critical thinking over corporate narratives. Second, hit the like button. I know it seems trivial, but that small gesture tells YouTube's algorithm that this content is relevant. And when the algorithm learns that serious geopolitical analysis works better than superficial clickbait, it begins recommending it to more people. Your like isn't for me. It's for the tens of thousands of people who haven't found this channel yet, but need this information. Third, tell me in the comments where you're watching this from. Are you from Mexico, Argentina, Spain, Colombia, the United States? I want to know because this community is growing globally. And when I see comments from 15 different countries, it reminds me why I do this. Because truth has no borders. Because honest analysis is universal. Because we all deserve to understand the real world, not the sanitized version that corporate media sells. So comment, tell me your perspective. Tell me if you're seeing changes in your country. Tell me if your local economy is feeling the effects of this global economic war. Because this isn't just a YouTube channel. This is a movement of people who refuse to be manipulated. And every comment, every subscription, every like strengthens this movement. Now let's talk about why this affects you personally. Because this Russian operation is not abstract. It has direct consequences for your daily life. Maybe you're thinking, this is interesting, but what does it have to do with me? I don't live in Ukraine. I don't work in geopolitics. Why should I care that Putin launches missiles in Eastern Europe? Let me show you exactly how this affects your wallet. Russia and Ukraine together produce 30% of the world's wheat. When Russian missiles destroy Ukrainian infrastructure, they disrupt grain supply chains. When they disrupt supply chains, wheat prices rise globally. When wheat prices rise, bread costs more, pasta costs more, everything containing flour costs more. Since February 2022, basic food prices have increased 35% on average in Latin America. This isn't random inflation, it's a direct consequence of this global economic war. Europe imported 40% of its natural gas from Russia before this crisis. When the West sanctioned Russia, gas prices skyrocketed, and when gas prices rise in Europe, they affect global energy markets, because energy is an interconnected market. If Europe competes for liquefied natural gas from the Persian Gulf, prices rise for everyone. Since 2022, electricity prices have increased 60% in Spain, 80% in Germany, 120% in the United Kingdom. And in Latin America, countries that import gas are seeing 40–50% increases in energy bills. This is not coincidence. It's economic warfare hitting your home. When the United States confiscated $300 billion in Russian reserves, every government in the world learned the dollar can be confiscated, so they began to diversify. China sells treasury bonds. Saudi Arabia reduces dollar dependence. BRICS builds alternative payment systems. What does that mean for you? It means the dollar is losing its status as the world's reserve currency. And when that happens, the United States loses its ability to finance massive deficits without consequences. And when it loses that ability, treasury bonds fall in value. And when bonds fall, interest rates rise. And when rates rise, mortgages cost more, car loans cost more, credit cards cost more. If you have savings in dollars, you're watching their purchasing power erode slowly. If you have debts in dollars, you're watching interest rates increase. This is not an accident. It's the direct result of the global economic war unleashed by the West's decision to weaponize the financial system against Russia. But there is hope. And it's not abstract hope, it's concrete hope based on what is emerging on the other side of this transition. A multipolar world means no country can impose unilateral sanctions that destroy entire economies. It means the global South has options. Trade with China, with India, with Russia, with BRICS, not just with the West. It means Latin American countries can negotiate better terms because there's competition for their trade. Argentina now sells meat to China. Brazil sells soybeans to India. Mexico signs agreements with Russia. This was impossible 20 years ago when the West controlled all markets. Now it's reality. The transition is painful. Your supermarket reflects it. Your energy bill reflects it. Your savings reflect it. But the transition is also inevitable. And on the other side is a world where your country has more options, more trading partners, more negotiating leverage. Stay alert, stay informed, and understand that what you're witnessing is not random chaos. It's the birth of a new world order. Corporate media will tell you this is a temporary crisis, that soon we'll return to normal. But there is no return. The normalcy you knew, American hegemony, dollar dominance, NATO expanding without resistance, that normalcy died this week when 120 Russian missiles crossed European skies and NATO could not respond. You are witnessing how the foundations of world order are being reorganized, not from a conference room in Brussels, not from a speech at the United Nations, from the battlefield. From economic sanctions, from the decisions of hundreds of global South countries that no longer accept being dictated to by the West. The transition has already happened. The world just hasn't realized it yet.